What if everything you've been told to ignore has already happened before, in exactly this order, every single time civilization forgot God? Not once, not twice. Every time, across thousands of years, the same sequence repeats itself with an almost mathematical precision. And the strange part is, most people living through it never notice, because it never announces itself the way we expect it to. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because what I'm about to walk you through tonight is not fear for the sake of fear. It's not sensationalism, and it's not me trying to alarm you into staying until the end of this video. It's a pattern. And once you see a pattern clearly, laid out across centuries, across cultures, across completely unrelated moments in history, you cannot unsee it. It starts to explain things about the world you're living in right now that used to feel confusing or random, and suddenly they don't feel random anymore. I've spent years studying spiritual theology, the lives of the saints, the writings of the mystics the church has actually examined and approved, and the quiet, repeating rhythm of how God deals with a world that has stopped listening. And here is the first thing I need you to understand before we go any further, because everything else I say tonight rests on this one foundation. God does not surprise His people. He warns them, every time, without exception. This is not a hopeful guess on my part. It is, quite literally, the consistent pattern of the entire biblical narrative and everything that has followed it since. Before the flood, there was Noah, preaching for over 100 years to a world that laughed at him, mocked him, and went about its business as though nothing could possibly touch it. Before Sodom, Abraham was told plainly, in a direct conversation, exactly what was coming and why. Before the exile of Israel, there were prophets, decades of them, generation after generation, saying essentially the same warning in different voices, different styles, different moments in history, but always the same underlying message. Before Jerusalem fell in the 1st century, in a catastrophe so severe that ancient historians described it as one of the worst sieges in the history of the ancient world, Christ Himself told His followers exactly what sign to watch for. Not vaguely, specifically. So specifically that when the moment came, those who remembered His words walked out of the city while there was still time, and those who dismissed it as fear-mongering stayed, and did not survive what followed. That is the pattern. Warning first. Always first. Never as theater, never as a way to manipulate emotion, never as entertainment dressed up in religious language. Always because mercy insists on giving people one more chance before justice is allowed to move. That is a distinction worth sitting with. A warning is not the punishment. A warning is the mercy that exists specifically to prevent the punishment, or at least to soften it, if enough people are willing to listen. So when I tell you that the warnings right now in our own time are not scattered the way they once were, that they are converging from multiple, completely unrelated directions at once, I need you to actually hear that instead of scrolling past it the way so many people scroll past everything that asks something of them. Let me take you somewhere most people never go, into the actual lives of the mystics the church has taken seriously enough to formally examine. Not internet legends passed around in comment sections. Not vague, anonymous prophecy accounts with no history and no accountability. Real, documented, examined lives, lived by real people whose experiences were investigated by actual theologians long after their deaths, sometimes over the course of decades. Take Fatima in 1917. This is not folklore whispered in the back pews of a rural parish. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 people gathered in an open field, including journalists who came specifically hoping to disprove the whole event, and secular officials who had no religious motive to lie about what they saw. What happened that day was reported the next morning in newspapers that had no interest in promoting religious belief. Whatever you personally believe about the deeper meaning of the message given there, the event itself was witnessed at a scale that is very difficult to simply wave away as mass delusion or coincidence. And what was reported by the children involved was not vague, comforting language designed to make people feel good. It spoke plainly of wars still to come, of persecution, of suffering for the church itself, and of a clear warning that if the world did not turn back from the direction it was heading, greater darkness would follow. History is not silent on what happened next. The world did not turn back. And the century that followed, by almost any honest historical measure, became the bloodiest in recorded human history, with conflicts and ideologies that produced suffering on a scale no earlier century had ever managed to reach. Or take St. Faustina, a Polish nun living a quiet, largely unnoticed life in a convent in the 1930s, decades before anyone outside her small religious community had ever heard her name. She described, in a private diary she was instructed to keep, an encounter so specific and so theologically coherent that decades after her death, the Church would use her writings as the foundation for one of the most widely practiced devotions in the modern world, observed today by millions of people who have likely never even read her original diary. What she described was not primarily about fear. It was about mercy being extended before judgment, always in that order. Mercy first, offered again and again, right up until the final moment when it is no longer offered. I bring these two examples up out of many I could have chosen because they show you the exact same shape, repeated over and over across completely different centuries, completely different countries, completely different personalities who never met each other and had no way of coordinating their message. A soul is shown something difficult to carry. They weep over it, not because they doubt the goodness of God, but because they can see with painful clarity what everyone else around them is simply too distracted, too comfortable, or too entertained to notice. And then, without exception, they are given one instruction consistently across centuries, across countries, across completely unrelated mystics. Pray, return to the sacraments and to a serious spiritual life, and turn back before it becomes too late to turn back. Now, I want to be very careful here because this is exactly where a lot of people online, in this exact kind of video, tend to lose the plot entirely. Private revelation, even revelation the Church has looked at favorably over time, is never something you are required to believe as a matter of doctrine. The Church has been remarkably clear and consistent about that for centuries, precisely because she takes seriously the difference between what has been formally defined as truth and what remains, even when respected, a matter of personal spiritual conviction. What I am not asking you to do tonight is treat every specific detail from every mystic as a guaranteed, itemized prophecy about next year or next decade. What I am asking you to do is notice the pattern itself, because the pattern is where the actual weight lies, far more than in any single specific prediction. So let's talk honestly about the signs people are living through right now, because they are not subtle if you actually stop and look at them. Instead of simply scrolling past them the way most of us scroll past almost everything that asks something real of us. The first is what I would describe as the quiet disappearance of shared moral language. 50 or 60 years ago, even people who did not practice any particular faith still largely agreed on the broad outline of what a good life looked like, what basic decency required, what a functioning family and community owed to each other. That shared floor, the one almost everyone once stood on regardless of their personal beliefs, has largely eroded in many parts of the world. Institutions that once quietly handed down moral formation from one generation to the next, families, schools, civic and community life, have in many places either stopped doing that work altogether, or in some cases started doing something close to the opposite of what they were originally built for. The second sign is the visible strain running through religious institutions themselves. I say this not with bitterness or with any desire to tear anything down, but with genuine pastoral concern, the kind that comes from actually caring about the health of a community rather than simply criticizing it from a distance. Confusion at higher levels of leadership emptying congregations, a depth of formation and teaching that in many communities has grown noticeably thin compared to earlier generations. Saints like John Bosco, writing in the 1800s, described this exact kind of turbulence in visions he recorded, using the image of a ship battered from every direction by storms and hostile vessels, yet never actually sinking, because it remained anchored to something solid beneath the surface. That image has endured for well over a century for a reason. It names both the danger clearly and the promise clearly in the very same picture, without pretending one exists without the other. The third sign, and the one I think people underestimate the most because it hides in plain sight, dressed up as entertainment and aesthetics, is how casually much of the culture now treats what earlier generations would have considered spiritually serious ground. curiosity about the occult, about divination, about practices that used to carry real and widely understood caution, has in recent years become almost fashionable, showing up in music, in casual conversation, in entertainment marketed toward very young audiences. Whatever conclusions you personally draw from that theologically, it tells you something important, at minimum, about where large numbers of people are now looking for meaning and mystery, now that they have quietly stopped looking somewhere else. None of this, taken on its own, proves a specific date or a specific catastrophic event is arriving on any particular timeline. I am not going to stand here and tell you I know exactly what is coming or when, because frankly, nobody credible actually claims to know that with certainty, and anyone who tells you otherwise, with total confidence and a specific date attached, should immediately raise your skepticism rather than your fear. What I will tell you, with real confidence built on genuine historical and theological study, is this: the pattern that has appeared before every major turning point in recorded religious history is visibly appearing again in our own time. And the only response that has ever actually mattered in every single one of those earlier moments was never panic. It was quiet, sustained, deliberate preparation. So let's talk in real, practical terms about what preparation actually looks like, because this is the part most videos like this one skip past entirely in favor of more dramatic imagery. And it is the only part that actually changes anything in a person's life. It starts with honesty, plain and uncomfortable honesty with yourself. If there is something in your life you have been quietly avoiding dealing with, a habit you know is hurting you, a resentment you have been nursing instead of releasing, a distance you have allowed to grow between yourself and your own conscience, that is the place to begin, not the news cycle, not the latest alarming headline. Go make it right. If confession or its equivalent is part of your tradition, go. Not eventually. Not when it becomes more convenient. This week, it continues with a daily practice of prayer that is actually consistent, not the 15-minute, deeply intentional version you manage only when you happen to remember or when a crisis prompts you, but something small enough and realistic enough that you will genuinely keep doing it on ordinary days when nothing dramatic is happening at all. Consistency beats intensity almost every single time in the spiritual life, just as it does in nearly every other area of life worth taking seriously. A soul that prays every single day, even briefly, even imperfectly, becomes over months and years a genuinely different kind of soul than one that only turns to prayer in emergencies and then quietly sets it aside once the emergency passes. It includes real, embodied participation in whatever sacramental or communal spiritual life your own tradition offers, not approached as an obligation to be checked off a list out of guilt, but as something you actually show up for consistently and actually mean when you are there, rather than simply going through familiar motions. And it includes community, real and ongoing, not merely occasional. No serious spiritual life survives for long in total isolation, no matter how strong a person's private convictions might feel in the moment. Every generation that made it through genuine historical upheaval, the early Christians scattered across a collapsing empire, the monks who quietly preserved learning and faith through centuries widely remembered as dark and unstable, did it together, in community, never entirely alone. Last, it includes a kind of loosening, a willingness to hold comfort, money, social status, and carefully laid plans a little less tightly than we are naturally inclined to hold them. Not because any of those things are inherently bad or something to be ashamed of, but because anything a person has built their entire sense of peace on top of will eventually be tested by life, sooner or later, in one form or another. And the only foundation that reliably holds under real, sustained pressure is the one that is not made primarily of things that can simply be taken away in an instant. I want to end with something important tonight, because I do not want you walking away from this carrying only weight, only dread, only a vague, unresolved sense of anxiety with nowhere useful to place it. Every single one of the mystics I have mentioned tonight, the ones who wept openly over what they were shown, did not end their story there, in tears, in despair. Every one of them also spoke, often at length, about renewal that follows even the darkest seasons, about a community of faith and a wider world that comes through fire genuinely changed for the better, not simply destroyed and left in ruins. History backs this pattern up as well, again and again, if you are willing to actually look at it honestly. In the 1500s, at a moment when it looked to almost everyone living through it like the Christian faith in Europe was fracturing beyond any hope of repair, with entire nations breaking away and the future looking genuinely bleak from every reasonable angle. That exact same turbulent moment in history went on to produce some of the deepest and most enduring spiritual renewal the faith has ever experienced. A renewal whose effects are still visible centuries later. Darkness and renewal have always traveled together throughout history, almost as if one calls the other into being. That is the actual complete pattern, from beginning to end, not simply doom standing on its own with nothing beyond it. There is one more piece of this I want to walk through with you, because I think it is the piece that gets skipped the most often, and it is, in some ways, the most important one of all. It is the question of why any of this would matter to someone who does not consider themselves particularly religious, someone watching this less out of faith and more out of a nagging sense that something in the world genuinely feels off right now, even if they could not name exactly what it is. Here is what I would say to that person directly. You do not need to accept every theological claim I have made tonight to recognize a simple, almost universal human truth. Every civilization that has ever lasted for more than a generation or two has been built, whether its people fully realized it or not, on something deeper than convenience and comfort. It has been built on shared restraint, on people choosing again and again to place something larger than their own immediate appetite above that appetite. Call it virtue, call it discipline, call it faith, call it whatever language feels comfortable to you. The name matters less than the function. And when that deeper foundation erodes quietly over decades, without anyone ever voting on it or announcing it, societies do not usually collapse in a single dramatic afternoon. They drift slowly, until one day the ground that everyone assumed was solid turns out to have been thin the whole time. This is not a new observation. Historians have written about the decline of great civilizations for centuries, and if you study those accounts honestly, a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with any one religion in particular. Prosperity arrives. Restraint loosens, because restraint is uncomfortable and prosperity makes comfort easy to justify. Institutions that once transmitted shared meaning from one generation to the next grow weaker, because maintaining them requires effort that are comfortable. Society increasingly decides it would rather not spend. And then, often only in hindsight, people realize that what looked like strength was actually already hollowed out from the inside, waiting for a moment of real pressure to reveal what had quietly been lost. I say all of this not to frighten you further, but to offer you a second, independent path to the exact same conclusion. Even if you set aside every mystic I mentioned tonight, even if you approach this purely as a student of history and human behavior with no religious framework at all, you would still arrive at the same practical advice. Build your life on something deeper than comfort. Practice restraint before you are forced into it. Invest in real relationships and real community before you need them in an emergency. Because community built hastily during a crisis rarely holds the way community built patiently over years does. I also want to say something directly to anyone watching this who feels the weight of despair creeping in, because I know this kind of content can sometimes push people toward that feeling rather than away from it. And that would be the opposite of what I am hoping to accomplish tonight. Despair is, in its own way, a kind of surrender disguised as realism. It tells you that, because the problem is large, your small, ordinary effort could not possibly matter. And so you might as well stop trying. That voice has always existed, in every generation that faced genuine difficulty, and it has always been wrong. The people who quietly kept faith, kept learning, kept praying, kept showing up for their families and their communities through the hardest chapters of history rarely felt, in the moment, like they were doing anything significant. Most of them were simply ordinary people doing small, faithful things, day after day, without any guarantee that it would matter. It mattered anyway. It always has. So here is what I would genuinely ask you to walk away with tonight, more than anything else I have said. Not fear. Attention. The kind of quiet, sustained attention that actually changes how you spend tomorrow morning when you wake up, and the morning after that, and the one after that. Whatever is coming, And something always eventually is, because that pattern has proven true in every generation that came before ours without a single exception. The soul that has practiced consistently showing up, in honest prayer, in real honesty with itself, in genuine community, in small, unremarkable daily faithfulness that nobody else ever sees or applauds, is simply not the soul that gets shaken apart when real pressure finally arrives. That soul tends to be the one still standing calmly when the dust eventually settles, and very often it becomes the very soul that other frightened, disoriented people instinctively turn to when they are searching for their own footing again. Do not wait for some dramatic future moment to arrive before you finally start preparing seriously for it. Start today in the small, quiet, entirely unremarkable decision that nobody else watching your life will ever notice or praise you for. That has always been, in every generation, in every century, in every single example we have looked at tonight, the actual place where everything that matters gets decided long before anyone else can see it happening. Stay grounded. Stay faithful. And whatever you do, do not let fear be the thing that finally moves you. Let love move you instead, because love is what has always outlasted every fear that ever tried to stand in its way. Before you go, I want to leave you with one last image, because I think it captures everything I have tried to say tonight better than any single argument could. Think of someone tending a garden the night before a storm is forecast. They do not know exactly how hard the wind will blow, or precisely which branches will break, or whether the storm will even arrive at all in the end. But they go out anyway, in the quiet hours before it comes, and they do the small, unremarkable work of staking what can be staked and covering what can be covered, and making sure the roots that matter most are as steady as they can make them. Not out of panic, out of quiet, patient love for what they have spent years growing. That is the posture I would ask you to carry out of this video tonight, more than any specific fact or figure or historical date. Not the posture of someone bracing for disaster with clenched fists and a hardened heart, but the posture of someone tending carefully to what matters most, simply because it matters, storm or no storm. If nothing dramatic ever comes in your lifetime, that quiet work will still have made you a steadier, more faithful, more grounded person than you were before, and that alone would have been worth every bit of the effort. And if something does eventually come, in whatever form it takes, you will find that the roots you tended so carefully in the ordinary, unnoticed hours were exactly what you needed all along. Go and tend your garden. Go and pray. Go and be reconciled with whoever you have been avoiding, and with whatever part of your own conscience you have been avoiding as well. Do it today not because fear demands it of you, but because love does. And because love has always been patient enough to start exactly where you are right now.